They locked me out in the freezing snow for a cheap laugh, watching through the glass as I banged on the heavy oak door until my knuckles bled. They thought they had finally broken me. They thought I would always be the quiet, obedient workhorse who took their abuse. But the next morning, as they woke up in their warm beds, expecting me to apologize for ruining their evening, someone else was living inside their house. 12 frantic missed calls and one single text message. Later, they realized exactly who they had messed with. I am Lauren. I am 35 years old, a commercial real estate asset manager, and for my entire life, I was the designated punching bag of my family. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to financially cut off toxic relatives who treated your bank account like their personal playground. Growing up in the Chicago suburbs, I learned early on that love in my house was strictly transactional, and my account was always overdrawn. But nothing showcased the sheer delusion of my family, quite like our winter trips. The house in Aspen was a monument to my parents' obsession with appearances. It was a sprawling modern cabin with massive timber beams, heated stone floors, and floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the mountain. It was supposed to be a place for family bonding. Instead, it was an altar where my younger sister Rachel and her husband Terrence were worshipped, and I was expected to leave an offering. The storm outside was howling, whipping dry snow against the glass. Inside, the fire was roaring, casting a warm orange glow over the silver platters of roasted lamb and winter root vegetables on the massive dining table. But the real blizzard was happening right inside the room. Terrence swirled his glass, staring at the dark red liquid with absolute disgust. He was 34, heavily built, and carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no. He dropped his heavy silver fork onto his porcelain plate with a loud clatter that made my jaw tighten. "This is basically table water," Richard Terrence complained, looking directly at my father. "I cannot believe you did not stock the cellar with something decent. We are in Aspen, for crying out loud. We should be drinking Camus, not this $50 grocery store garbage." My father, Richard, a man who used to terrify me with his strict rules when I was a child, completely folded. He offered a weak, apologetic smile to his son-in-law. "I will have the concierge service deliver a case of the good stuff tomorrow, Terrence." "I am sorry about that." Without missing a beat, Terrence pulled out his phone, his thumbs aggressively tapping the screen. He let out an exaggerated sigh and tossed the phone onto the table. "And the internet here is an absolute joke. I am trying to stream the basketball game and check my crypto wallets, and it keeps buffering. You need to call the provider and pay for the gigabit fiber upgrade tomorrow morning. This is completely unlivable. I cannot operate in these conditions." Instead of telling Terrence to pay for his own internet, or maybe put his phone away at the dinner table, my father simply nodded defensively. "I will make the call first thing," he promised. My mother Susan smiled warmly, her diamond tennis bracelet catching the firelight as she passed a basket of warm buttered rolls across the table. She looked at Rachel with the kind of absolute unconditional adoration I had spent 3 decades trying to earn. Rachel, who was 32 and had never held a full-time job longer than 6 months, took a roll and tore it delicately into pieces. "Oh, speaking of tomorrow," Rachel announced casually, her bright blue eyes wide with innocent entitlement. "Terrence and I just booked a private helicopter ski tour for the weekend. The guide says the powder on the backside of the mountain is perfect right now." "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," my mother cooed. "You two need a break to reconnect." Rachel laughed, a high-pitched grating sound that echoed off the vaulted wooden ceilings. "I know, right? I had to put the $8,000 charge on your platinum card, Dad. My limit is completely maxed out from our shopping trip in Milan last month, and Terrence has his accounts tied up in his investments right now." My mother just beamed, reaching over to stroke Rachel's perfectly highlighted blonde hair. She told Rachel that she deserved a little luxury because the dry mountain altitude was so harsh on her delicate skin, and that family wealth was meant to be enjoyed. I sat there slicing my lamb, saying absolutely nothing. I was doing the mental math of their reckless spending in my head. $8,000 for a helicopter tour, $4,000 for the wine he was demanding, upgraded internet. It was a bottomless pit. The sheer audacity of it burned in my chest, a familiar acidic heat that I had learned to swallow down. I knew exactly how much that wine cost, just like I knew exactly how much the electric bill for this house cost. My father played the generous host, pouring wine and promising upgrades, completely omitting the fact that 3 months ago he was sitting in my downtown office sobbing uncontrollably because he had defaulted on a $400,000 home equity line of credit. He had begged me for a bailout to save this exact property. I kept my mouth shut, focusing entirely on my meal, desperately trying to get through this one dinner without an argument. Then Terence nudged his empty wine glass across the polished wood, pushing it directly toward my plate. He did not ask. He did not say please. He just tapped the rim of the crystal glass with the blade of his knife, a sharp, ringing sound that demanded my immediate attention. "Pour me some more of that cheap stuff, Lauren," he commanded. A smug, challenging grin spread across his face as he leaned back in his leather dining chair. The bottle of Cabernet was sitting on a marble coaster exactly halfway between us. He could easily reach it by extending his arm just 2 more inches. But this was not about the wine. This was about power. This was a test to see if the workhorse would perform her duties for the golden children. I looked at his empty glass. Then I slowly looked up at his entitled, expectant face. I set my knife and fork down gently on the edges of my plate. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my sparkling water. "You have two perfectly functional hands, Terence," I said, keeping my voice remarkably level and quiet. "You can reach the bottle yourself." The entire table went dead silent. The clinking of silverware stopped. The faint crackle of the burning cedar logs in the fireplace was suddenly the only sound in the massive room. Terence scoffed, shaking his head dramatically, as if I had just insulted his deepest core values. He leaned further back in his chair, crossing his thick arms over his chest. Always with the uptight corporate attitude, he sneered, looking around the table to gather his audience. "You know, Lauren, you treat everyone in this family like they are your junior employees. You think just because you wear stiff suits and manage commercial real estate that you run the world." I did not blink. I just stared at him. "It is honestly no wonder you are 35 and still sitting at the singles table," Terence continued, his voice dripping with venom masquerading as a joke. "You are way too rigid. Nobody wants to come home to a spreadsheet. You need to loosen up or you are going to die alone with your little property portfolios." My sister Rachel burst into sudden loud laughter, nearly choking on her bite of lamb. She slapped her hand on the table, finding her husband's cruelty absolutely hilarious. Instead of defending me, instead of demanding basic respect for their eldest daughter, my father chuckled along with them. He actually shook his head and took a sip of his wine, silently agreeing with the man who was currently burning through his retirement funds. My mother reached over and patted Terrence's arm affectionately, treating him like a clever child who had just told a funny joke. "Now, Terrence, be nice to your sister-in-law," my mother said, though her eyes were dancing with malicious amusement. "She is just stressed out from all that working. It must be very lonely in that big city apartment all by herself with no husband to take care of her. We should be patient with her bitterness." I looked at the four of them, a united front of delusion and toxicity. For years, this exact dynamic would have sent me running to the bathroom to cry silently into a towel, questioning what was wrong with me. I would have wondered why I was so unlovable, why my success in the commercial real estate world meant absolutely nothing to them, and why Rachel's mere existence was celebrated like a national holiday. But tonight was different. Tonight their laughter did not hurt me. It just bored me. Because they did not know the truth. They did not know about the legally binding transfer documents my father had signed in my office. And most importantly, as Terrence continued to mock my corporate attitude, none of them realized that my company legally owned the very roof over their heads, and their grace period was about to expire. My mother wiped her mouth elegantly with a linen napkin and set it down beside her plate. She looked at me with a soft, patronizing smile, perfectly shifting the energy in the room from mockery to manipulation. "Speaking of your corporate job, Lauren," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "your father and I had a contractor out here last week to look at the roof. The snow damage from last winter was much worse than we thought." I kept my eyes on my plate. How much I asked already, knowing the answer would be absurd. $30,000. My mother sighed heavily, as if the burden of the world was resting on her shoulders. Just to replace the cedar shingles and reinforce the beams. She reached across the table and placed her warm hand over my cold one. Lauren, since you insist on prioritizing your little corporate job over a husband, the least you could do is help out here. You do not have children to pay for. You have no real obligations. It is only fair that you contribute to the family legacy. I stared at her hand resting on mine. The sheer audacity of the request hung in the air. She was asking me to fund the maintenance of a luxury ski cabin for her golden child to use, while simultaneously insulting my entire life choices. I pulled my hand away slowly and met my father's eyes across the table. He immediately looked down at his roasted lamb, suddenly very interested in cutting his meat. "I am not paying for the roof," I said quietly. My mother gasped, pulling her hand back to her chest, as if I had just slapped her. Terrence let out a loud, dramatic groan and shook his head. "Here we go," Terrence muttered. "The resident billionaire cannot spare a few dimes for her own parents." I ignored him and kept my focus entirely on my father. "Dad," I said, my voice steady but firm, "are you really going to let her ask me for $30,000 right now? Are we just going to pretend the meeting we had in my office 3 months ago never happened?" My father's face instantly turned a deep shade of crimson. His head snapped up and his eyes widened in pure panic. "Lauren, that is enough," he barked, his voice cracking slightly. "We are eating dinner. This is not the time or the place for your accounting nonsense." I did not back down. My mother looked back and forth between us, her brow furrowed in genuine confusion. "What meeting, Richard?" she asked. "Nothing," my father snapped, practically sweating through his cashmere sweater. "Lauren is just being dramatic about a minor cash flow issue we had earlier this year. It is handled." A minor cash flow issue. I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. "Dad, you defaulted on a $400,000 home equity line of credit. The bank was 72 hours away from initiating foreclosure on this exact house. You sat in my office crying and begging me for a bailout because you had secretly drained the equity and missed 6 consecutive payments. I wired $400,000 to clear your debt. I think I have contributed enough to the family vacation fund." The dining room descended into absolute chaos. My mother dropped her fork. Rachel stopped chewing. But instead of apologizing or explaining himself, my father went on the offensive. He slammed his fist onto the heavy wooden table, making the crystal wine glasses rattle. "I told you that business was between us, Lauren," he yelled, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "How dare you throw your little favors in my face in front of the whole family? Family helps family. You have the money. It was a temporary setback, and you are sitting here trying to humiliate me over a loan. A little favor." He just called a $400,000 rescue mission a little favor. Rachel rolled her eyes so hard, I thought they might get stuck in the back of her head. "God, you are such a stingy accountant, Lauren," she groaned, crossing her arms. "You are always keeping score. You always pull out your mental calculator to make Dad feel bad. It is just money. Terrence and I would never hold a favor over family like this. You are so toxic." Terrence chimed right in, nodding in aggressive agreement with his wife. "Seriously, Lauren, it is pathetic. You make a little bit of cash and suddenly you think you can disrespect your father at his own dinner table. You cannot take the money to the grave with you. You should be grateful you even have a family to spend it on, since you clearly cannot keep a man around." My mother recovered from her brief shock and immediately aligned herself with my father and sister. She glared at me, her eyes cold and unforgiving. "Your sister is right, Lauren. You have always been obsessed with money and control. Your father asked you for a private favor and you weaponize it to ruin our family dinner. You should be ashamed of yourself. If you are going to be this disrespectful and hostile, you do not need to be sitting at this table." They all stared at me, a unified front of absolute delusion. They were completely convinced they had the moral high ground. They thought they were putting the bitter spinster daughter in her place. But as I sat there listening to them defend my father's financial ruin and attack my character, a strange sense of total calm washed over me. I did not feel the urge to cry. I did not feel the need to scream. I just looked at my father, who was still breathing heavily and glaring at me, trying to reassert his dominance. He was calling it a loan. He was calling it a little favor. That is when I realized the terrifying depth of his ignorance. When my father came to my office 3 months ago, desperate and facing immediate foreclosure, I told him my corporate compliance rules prevented me from giving out personal loans. I told him the only way I could clear the $400,000 debt was through a formal business acquisition. I placed a stack of legal documents on my desk that day. I told him to read them carefully. But he was so panicked, so eager to get his hands on the bailout money, that he just blindly flipped to the back pages and signed everywhere I placed a sticky note. He never read a single paragraph. If he had read the documents, he would have known that I did not give him a loan. I executed a warranty deed transfer. I bought the Aspen house from the bank to settle his debt. The paperwork he signed legally transferred full ownership of the property to Apex Holdings LLC. In exchange for the transfer, the contract granted my parents a 90-day grace period to remain on the premises as temporary tenants while they figured out their next steps. That 90-day grace period was set to expire at midnight tonight. They did not know. Rachel and Terrence did not know they were sitting in my dining room. My mother did not know she was asking me to buy a roof for a house I already owned, and my father, the man currently shouting at me and calling me toxic, had no idea that he was legally nothing more than an unpaid renter who had just violated the endangerment and liability clauses of his tenancy agreement. I looked at the 4 angry faces glaring at me across the expensive dinner spread. I realized then that I had spent my entire life trying to buy my way into a family that only saw me as an ATM. "You are absolutely right, Mother," I said, keeping my voice terrifyingly calm. "I am being hostile, and I apologize for ruining your meal." I stood up slowly, pushing my heavy wooden chair back against the stone floor. I did not raise my voice. I did not make a scene. I simply picked up my water glass, took one final sip, and looked down at them. "I will let you all finish your dinner in peace," I said. "I am going to step out for some fresh air." I turned my back on them and walked toward the heavy glass doors leading out to the back patio. I could hear Rachel scoffing behind me, muttering something to Terrence about my dramatic exits. I ignored it. I was not being dramatic. I was stepping outside to clear my head, but my sister was about to give me the perfect excuse to finally lock them out of my life. I reached the heavy glass doors and pulled the handle, letting the freezing mountain air hit my face. Before I could step completely through the threshold, Rachel called out to me. "Hey, Lauren!" she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension of the dining room. "Since you are going out there anyway, grab the expensive champagne we left cooling in the snowbank off the edge of the deck. Terrence needs something better to drink than your cheap table water." I stopped in the doorway. I was wearing a thin cream-colored silk blouse and a pair of indoor designer heels. I had not brought my heavy winter coat over to the dining area because I never intended to go outside, but I figured it would take exactly 10 seconds to step onto the patio, grab the bottle, and come right back inside. It was easier than starting another massive argument. I nodded without looking back at her and stepped fully onto the frosted wooden deck. The cold was immediate and violently sharp. It was exactly 12 degrees Fahrenheit in Aspen that night, and the wind chill made it feel well below zero. I shivered instantly, crossing my arms tightly over my chest as the icy wind whipped through my thin silk sleeves. I hurried to the edge of the patio, where a dark green bottle of vintage champagne was indeed buried halfway in a mound of fresh snow. I pulled it out, brushing the crystallized ice off the gold label, and turned back toward the warmth of the house. I heard the sound before I even reached the door. A heavy metallic thud echoed over the howling wind. It was the deadbolt. I reached the sliding glass door and pulled the metal handle. It did not budge. I pulled harder, thinking it was just stuck on the ice track. But then I looked through the glass and saw them. Rachel and Terrence were standing right on the other side of the sliding door. Rachel had her hand resting flat against the glass, a massive, mocking smile stretching across her perfectly made-up face. She was laughing so hard, her shoulders shook visibly through the window. Terrence was standing right beside her, holding his smartphone up horizontally. The harsh glare of the camera flash was turned on. He was recording me. I dropped the bottle of champagne. It fell into a snowdrift with a soft thud disappearing into the powder. I slammed my bare hand against the heavy double-paned glass. "Open the door, Rachel," I yelled. My voice was muffled, completely swallowed by the howling mountain wind. Rachel just shook her head exaggeratedly, pretending she could not hear me. She pointed at my freezing, shivering body and nudged Terrence, who was grinning from ear to ear, capturing every single second of my humiliation for whatever group chat or social media feed he planned to post it on. They were treating my physical pain as a punchline. To them, this was just another hilarious prank to put the uptight corporate sister back in her place. I banged my fists against the glass again, harder this time. The sharp sting of the impact radiated up my forearms. "Let me in, Terrence," I shouted, my teeth beginning to chatter uncontrollably. "It is freezing out here. This is not funny." Terrence just zoomed in with his camera, mocking my frantic gestures. My silk blouse offered absolutely zero protection against the biting wind. The cold was already slicing through the thin fabric, settling deep into my bones. My bare toes were going numb inside my heels. I could feel the blood rushing away from my extremities as my body went into survival mode. I looked past the two of them, desperately searching the dining room for my parents. My father was sitting at the table finishing his glass of wine, deliberately looking the other way. He saw me. I knew he saw me. But he chose to ignore it, just like he ignored every cruel thing Rachel had ever done to me since we were children. Then my mother walked into the frame. She stepped up behind Rachel and Terrence, holding a fresh, warm cup of coffee. I locked eyes with her through the frosty glass. I stopped banging on the door. I waited for her to scold them. I waited for the mother I had spent my entire life trying to please to finally step in and protect me. I thought surely she would draw the line at physical endangerment. My mother looked at my shivering, blue-lipped reflection. She looked at Terrence recording me. And then she smiled. She shook her head softly, as if watching a group of toddlers play a harmless, innocent game. She reached over, patted Rachel on the shoulder affectionately, and calmly walked away toward the living room, completely abandoning me to the freezing elements. In that exact moment, standing in the knee-deep snow of the Colorado mountains, something inside me fundamentally broke. Or maybe it finally healed. The desperate, lonely little girl who just wanted her family to love her died on that patio. As the numbness crept up my fingers and toes, a different kind of cold took over my heart. A cold that was sharp, calculated, and utterly merciless. All the guilt I carried about my success, all the obligation I felt toward my parents, all the excuses I made for my sister simply evaporated into the winter air. I stopped knocking. I let my hands fall to my sides. I stood perfectly still in the freezing wind, staring directly into Terrence's camera lens. I did not give them the satisfaction of seeing me cry. I did not beg. The last shred of my loyalty to these people shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They wanted to lock me out of their warm, cozy family bubble. They wanted to see me freeze. They had absolutely no idea that they had just handed me the keys to their destruction. I turned my back on the glass door. I did not look back as Rachel and Terrence continued to laugh behind the safety of the glass. I took a deep breath of the icy air, letting it burn my lungs, and I began to trudge through the deep snow. I was not walking toward the front door to knock and beg my father to let me in. I was walking around the side of the massive cabin toward the long driveway where my heavy-duty SUV was parked. The walk felt like miles. My heels sank deep into the snowpack, completely ruining the expensive leather, but I did not care. My feet were so numb I could not even feel the frozen ground beneath me. By the time I reached my vehicle, my hands were shaking so violently I could barely operate the electronic door handle. I pulled the heavy door open and climbed into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut, blocking out the howling wind, and hit the push to start ignition. The engine roared to life, and I immediately cranked the heater up to its absolute maximum setting. I sat there in the dark driveway for several minutes, shaking uncontrollably, rubbing my hands together in front of the blasting air vents until the painful prickling sensation of returning circulation started to burn my skin. Once I could finally bend my fingers again without searing pain, I reached into my center console and pulled out my phone. The screen lit up the dark cabin of my car. I had 3 missed texts from Rachel. The first one was a picture of me standing outside looking pathetic with my arms crossed. The second one said, "Maybe you should do some jumping jacks to warm up that cold heart of yours." The third one said, "We will unlock the door when you agree to pay for the roof and apologize to Dad." I read the messages and felt absolutely nothing. No anger, no sadness, just pure, unwavering clarity. I deleted the text thread. I did not call the local police to report them. I did not call my parents to negotiate my surrender. Instead, I opened my contacts and dialed the emergency after hours number for the commercial asset management team at Apex Holdings LLC. The phone rang twice before my lead property manager picked up. "Good evening, Lauren," he said, sounding slightly surprised to hear from me on a weekend. "Is everything all right?" I stared through my frosted windshield at the massive glowing cabin, watching the faint silhouettes of my family moving around inside, enjoying the warmth of a home they did not actually own. "No," I said, my voice completely steady and devoid of any emotion. "I need you to execute the foreclosure lockout order on the Aspen property immediately." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. "The grace period for the previous owners is technically valid until midnight tonight, Lauren," he replied, his tone shifting to professional concern. "Are you sure you want to expedite this before Monday morning?" "They just violated the endangerment and liability clause of the temporary tenancy agreement," I replied, putting my SUV into drive and slowly pulling out of the snowy driveway. "The grace period is officially terminated. Dispatch the local property preservation agents and coordinate a civil standby with the sheriff's department. I want the locks changed by 6 in the morning." "Understood, Lauren," he said, typing rapidly on a keyboard in the background. "I will make the calls right now. Consider the property secured." I hung up the phone and tossed it onto the passenger seat. I drove slowly down the winding mountain road, leaving the cabin behind me. I headed toward a luxury resort in the valley where I would spend the night in a warm, king-sized bed with a clear conscience. My family thought they had won. They thought they had taught me a lesson about respect and hierarchy. But as the snow continued to fall, burying my tire tracks in the driveway, they had no idea that they were sleeping in my house for the very last time. At exactly 6 in the morning, the heavy oak front door of the Aspen cabin shuddered under the force of a master key. Inside the house, it was completely silent. The massive fire in the living room had burned down to cold gray ash. Rachel and Terrence were asleep in the primary suite, wrapped in expensive down comforters. My parents were sound asleep in the guest wing. None of them heard the 2 heavy-duty work trucks pull into the freshly plowed driveway. Donovan was a massive man who had spent 15 years doing property preservation and forced commercial evictions. He did not care about designer furniture or the luxury ski resort aesthetic. He cared about executing his work orders efficiently. He stepped into the grand foyer, wiping his heavy snow boots aggressively on my mother's imported Persian rug. Behind him, 2 local county sheriff deputies walked in their hands, resting casually on their duty belts, ready to perform a civil standby. Donovan immediately went to work. He unclipped a heavy power drill from his tool belt and stepped up to the front door from the inside. The loud mechanical grinding of the drill dismantling the deadbolt echoed like a gunshot through the vaulted wooden ceilings of the quiet cabin. Upstairs, a door slammed open. Heavy footsteps pounded down the hardwood hallway. Terrence came stomping down the grand staircase wearing navy blue silk pajamas. His face was twisted in absolute fury. He thought it was maintenance, or maybe a concierge staff member who had made too much noise. "What the hell is going on down here?" Terrence yelled, his voice booming through the foyer. "Who are you people? Get out of my house before I call the police and have you locked up." Donovan did not even look up from his drill. He calmly removed the lock cylinder and dropped it into his tool pouch. The 2 armed deputies stepped forward out of the shadows of the hallway. Terrence froze halfway down the staircase. His arrogant bravado instantly vanished when he saw the badges and the uniforms. Rachel appeared at the top of the stairs, clutching a silk robe tightly around her waist. Her perfectly highlighted hair was a mess, and her face was pale. "Terence, what is happening?" she asked, her voice trembling. My father Richard hurried down the hallway right behind her, pushing past Rachel to see what the commotion was about. When he saw the deputy standing in his living room, his face turned the color of chalk. "Officers, there must be some kind of misunderstanding," my father said, rushing down the stairs and trying to put on his best authoritative voice. "I am the owner of this property. Richard, you have no right to be inside my home." Donovan finished installing the new lock and turned around. He was a foot taller than my father and built like a tank. He pulled a thick metal clipboard from his jacket and held it out. "There is no misunderstanding, sir," Donovan said, his voice flat and professional. "I am executing an immediate eviction and property securing order. You and your guests are currently trespassing on privately owned corporate real estate." My father let out a nervous scoff, refusing to take the clipboard. "That is completely ridiculous. I have the deed in my safe upstairs. This house has been in my name for 10 years. Donovan shoved the clipboard directly into my father's chest, forcing him to take it. "Look at the paperwork, sir. The property was legally transferred 90 days ago in a debt settlement acquisition. You were granted a temporary tenancy grace period, which was officially revoked at midnight due to a violation of the liability clauses. You do not own this house." My father looked down at the official documents. His eyes scanned the bold black text. He saw the notice of foreclosure acquisition. He saw the termination of the grace period. And then his eyes landed on the name of the new legal owner, Apex Holdings, LLC. He recognized it immediately. It was the name on the front of my corporate office building. It was my company. My father literally gasped, taking a step back as if he had been physically struck. His hands began to shake so violently the clipboard rattled. "What does it say, Richard?" my mother asked, coming down the stairs and grabbing his arm. "Tell these men to leave. We are going on a helicopter tour in 3 hours." "It is Lauren," my father whispered, staring blankly at the wall. "The company. It is Lauren's company. She owns the house. She evicted us." Terence ripped the clipboard out of my father's hands, reading it for himself. His eyes widened in disbelief and then narrowed in pure rage. "This is illegal," he screamed, waving the paper at the deputies. "You cannot just throw people out in the snow. She is his daughter. This is a family dispute, not a legal eviction." One of the deputies stepped right up to Terence, looking him dead in the eye. "Sir, this is a commercial property owned by a limited liability company, and you have no legal right to be here. You have exactly 30 minutes to pack your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you refuse to leave voluntarily, we will arrest you for criminal trespassing. If you damage any fixtures on your way out, we will arrest you for destruction of corporate property. Your 30 minutes starts right now." Rachel burst into loud hysterical tears, collapsing onto the stairs. She wailed that her designer clothes were going to get ruined and that it was too cold outside to pack the cars. Donovan simply pointed at the clock on the wall and told her she now had 29 minutes. 5 miles away down in the valley, the morning sun was just starting to peek over the snow-capped mountains. I was sitting in a warm, upscale coffee shop, sipping a freshly brewed vanilla latte. The smell of roasted espresso beans and warm pastries filled the air. I was wearing a soft cashmere sweater, feeling completely rested after a full 8 hours of sleep in my luxury hotel suite. I set my ceramic mug down on the wooden table as my phone screen lit up. The silence of my morning was broken by the frantic buzzing of my device. It was 6:42 in the morning. Missed call from Dad. Missed call from Dad again. Missed call from Terence. Missed call from Rachel. Missed call from Mom. I sat back in my chair and watched the notifications flood my screen. 12 missed calls in the span of 10 minutes. I did not answer a single one. I just watched the names pop up, letting them panic, letting them realize that their actions finally had irreversible consequences. When the calls finally stopped, the voicemail notifications began to chime. I picked up my phone, pressed play, and brought the speaker to my ear. The first voicemail was from my father, His voice was breathless and desperate, entirely stripped of the arrogant authority he had used to belittle me at the dinner table the night before. "Lauren, answer your phone right now. There are police in the house. There has been a massive mistake with the bank documents. Call these people off immediately. We can talk about the roof, we can talk about everything. Just call me back." I smiled, taking another slow sip of my coffee. I deleted the message and played the next one. It was Rachel. She was sobbing so hard she could barely form a coherent sentence. "Lauren, they are making me put my silk dresses in black trash bags. Make them stop. This is illegal. You cannot do this to me. I am your sister. It is freezing outside. We have nowhere to go. Please tell them to let us stay." The irony of her crying about the cold was not lost on me. I deleted her message too. The final voicemail was from Terrence. "Listen to me, you crazy witch." Terrence growled into the phone, his voice shaking with furious entitlement. "I am going to sue you for everything you have. You do not own this place. Call these thugs off right now, or I swear to God I will destroy your career. You are going to pay for this." I lowered the phone from my ear. Terrence was still trying to give orders from a house he was currently being kicked out of. They were all still functioning under the delusion that I would eventually cave, that I would apologize for defending myself, and let them go back to abusing me. I opened the family group chat. I saw dozens of frantic messages begging, demanding, and threatening me to answer my phone. I tapped the text box. I did not write a long emotional paragraph explaining how much they hurt me. I did not demand an apology for leaving me to freeze on the patio. They did not deserve my vulnerability. They only deserved the cold, hard facts. I typed one single sentence. "You locked out the landlord. The property is now secured. Please leave your keys on the kitchen counter." I hit send. I watched the text bubble appear at the bottom of the group chat. The entire thread went dead silent for a full minute. I could picture the four of them standing in the driveway, surrounded by black trash bags, shivering in the freezing mountain air, staring at their phone screens as the reality of their situation finally crushed them. Then the typing indicator popped up from Rachel. A second later, a barrage of furious curse words and threats flooded my screen. I did not read them. I simply went into my settings and blocked Rachel's number. Then I blocked Terrence, then Mom, then Dad. I placed my phone face down on the table. The sun was shining brightly through the coffee shop window, warming my face. I picked up my fork and took a bite of my warm, buttered croissant. My family had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, but as I sat there enjoying my breakfast, I had never felt bigger. The eviction was only the beginning. They had no idea that their entire financial world was about to collapse, and I was the one holding the sledgehammer. 2 days later, I received a formal email from a man named Gregory Barnes, who claimed to be my parents' new legal counsel. The email demanded my immediate presence at my parents' primary suburban home in Chicago for an emergency family settlement meeting. It stated that if I did not show up, they would file an emergency injunction against my company for illegal eviction and severe emotional distress. I did not reply to the email. I simply printed out 2 specific file folders from my corporate archives, locked them in my leather briefcase, and drove out to the suburbs. When I pulled into the wide paved driveway of their 5-bedroom colonial house, I noticed Rachel and Terrence had parked their luxury sedan haphazardly on the lawn. They were clearly living here now. I walked up the stone path and rang the doorbell. My mother answered the door. She did not greet me. She did not offer me a cup of coffee. She just glared at me with pure venom and stepped aside, pointing silently toward the formal dining room. I walked into the room and found the entire family sitting around the long mahogany table. My father sat at the head of the table, looking exhausted but defensive. Rachel was dabbing her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the traumatized victim. Terrence was standing behind her chair with his arms crossed, trying to look physically imposing. Next to my father sat Gregory Barnes. He was wearing a cheap, wrinkled suit that looked like it had been sitting in the back of his closet for a decade. He had a manila folder spread open in front of him, and he was tapping his pen against the wood with an arrogant smirk. "Have a seat, Lauren," the lawyer said, gesturing to the single empty chair at the opposite end of the table. We have a lot to discuss, and frankly, it is in your best financial interest to cooperate. I did not sit down. I placed my leather briefcase softly on the table and stood perfectly straight. I am perfectly comfortable standing, I said. You called this meeting, Gregory. Go ahead and speak. Terence scoffed loudly, shaking his head. Do not come in here acting like you own the place, he growled, taking a heavy step toward me. You are not at your little corporate office anymore. You are going to listen to what the man says, and you are going to fix the mess you made. I did not even look at Terence. I kept my eyes completely locked on the lawyer, waiting for him to make his move. Gregory cleared his throat and adjusted his tie. He puffed out his chest, clearly trying to intimidate a younger woman. Your family has retained my services to file a massive civil lawsuit against you and your company. Gregory began, his voice loud and theatrical. You executed an illegal self-help eviction on a pregnant woman and elderly individuals in freezing conditions. You bypassed the county housing court completely. My clients are prepared to sue you for wrongful eviction, emotional distress, and gross negligence. We will tie your company up in litigation for years. However, because Richard and Susan are generous people, they are willing to settle this out of court today. My mother leaned forward, resting her hands on the table. All you have to do, Lauren, is sign the Aspen property back over to your father and pay Rachel $100,000 for the emotional trauma you caused her baby. If you do that, we will drop the lawsuit and we will never ask you for anything ever again. Rachel sniffled loudly, nodding in agreement. You almost killed us out there, Lauren. The least you can do is make it right. I looked at the four of them. They really thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought a cheap strip mall attorney with a loud voice was going to scare an asset manager who dealt with multi-million-dollar hostile acquisitions on a weekly basis. I popped the golden latches on my briefcase. The sharp click echoed in the quiet room. I reached inside and pulled out the first file folder. It was thick, heavy, and bound with a black legal clip. I walked around the table and set it down directly in front of Gregory Barnes. I am not sure what law school you attended, Gregory, I said, keeping my voice low and dangerously calm. But before you threaten a commercial real estate firm with an illegal eviction lawsuit, you should probably check the county deed registry. Gregory frowned, looking down at the folder. He opened it slowly. That is a certified copy of a warranty deed in lieu of foreclosure, I explained, watching the color slowly drain from the lawyer's face. 3 months ago, my father defaulted on a massive bank loan. To save him from bankruptcy, my holding company purchased the debt and acquired the property free and clear. My father signed those documents in the presence of a corporate notary. He was not a homeowner. He was a temporary tenant under a commercial grace period clause. And as you can see on page 12, that grace period is instantly nullified if the tenant creates a severe liability hazard on the premises. I pointed at the document, tapping the exact paragraph. Locking the legal property owner outside in 12-degree weather constitutes a severe liability hazard. The county sheriff reviewed these exact documents yesterday morning, which is why they executed the civil standby. There was no illegal eviction. Your clients were trespassing. Gregory was completely silent. His eyes darted frantically across the pages, reading the ironclad corporate legal jargon that he was entirely unqualified to fight. He flipped to the back page and saw my father's signature right next to the bright blue notary stamp. He knew instantly that he had absolutely no case. He knew my parents had lied to him. Gregory closed the folder. He did not say a word to my father. He just quickly shoved his pen into his pocket, grabbed his cheap briefcase, and stood up. Where are you going? Terence demanded, stepping in front of the lawyer. Tell her she has to pay us. Move out of my way, Gregory snapped, pushing past Terence. I am not getting disbarred over this. You people lied to me. I suggest you find another attorney because I am officially withdrawing my representation. The lawyer practically jogged out of the dining room. We heard the heavy front door slam shut a second later. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother slowly turned her head and looked at my father. The smug, confident expression she had worn just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a look of sheer, terrifying confusion. Richard, my mother whispered, her voice shaking. What did he just say? What default? What loan? You told me the house was completely fine. You told me Lauren was just throwing a tantrum. My father was sweating. He was gripping the edges of the table so hard his knuckles were completely white. Susan, please, he stammered, looking around the room like a trapped animal. It is complicated. The market took a downturn and I had to make some adjustments. I was going to buy the house back from Lauren next year. Rachel stood up from her chair, her fake tears instantly vanishing. Wait a minute, she said, her voice rising in panic. Dad, did you lose the Aspen house? That was supposed to be my inheritance. What happened to your retirement accounts? You told Terrence and me that we were covered. I stepped back toward my briefcase. The family front had cracked, but it had not shattered yet. They still did not know the worst part. They still thought my father was just a victim of a bad stock market. It was time to completely destroy the illusion. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the second folder. This one was much thinner. It contained only bank records. I tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table where everyone could see it. He did not lose the money in the stock market, Mother, I said, my voice cutting through the rising panic in the room. When I acquired the debt, I requested a full audit of his accounts to understand how a $400,000 line of credit disappeared in less than a year. My father lunged forward, trying to grab the folder. Lauren, stop, he screamed. Do not show them that. But Terrence was faster. He snatched the folder off the table and ripped it open. As his eyes scanned the bank transfer logs, his face turned completely ashen. He slowly backed away from the table, staring at the papers in absolute horror. Look at the routing numbers, I instructed, pointing at the documents in Terrence's shaking hands. My father did not make a bad investment. He wired $400,000 directly into a shell account owned by Terrence. My mother let out a blood-curdling shriek. She grabbed the edge of the table, her eyes wide with shock. Richard, she screamed at my father, tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not give our entire life savings to this worthless man. My father buried his face in his hands, sobbing loudly. Terrence told me it was a guaranteed crypto mining startup. My father cried, his voice muffled by his fingers. He said it would triple our money in 6 months. He showed me charts. He showed me projections. I just wanted to secure the family legacy, but the company vanished. The money is gone. Rachel turned slowly to look at her husband. The golden child, the woman who had spent her entire life expecting luxury and endless pampering, was suddenly staring at the man who had secretly bankrupted her family. Terrence, you told me your crypto investments were tied up. Rachel whispered, her voice trembling with pure rage. You told me you were building an empire for our baby. Terrence took a step back, holding his hands up defensively. Baby, listen to me, he stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. The market crashed. It was not my fault. The exchange froze my assets. I was going to make it all back. You stole my parents' money, Rachel screamed, lunging at him and hitting him in the chest with her fists. You lost my inheritance. You told me we were rich. We are broke. We have nothing. Terrence grabbed her wrists, trying to push her away, yelling that her father was the one stupid enough to sign the wire transfers. My mother was screaming at both of them, throwing a glass of water across the room where it shattered against the wall. My father just sat there weeping into his hands, a broken, pathetic man who had sacrificed his entire family to protect a fragile ego. The perfect toxic family dynamic had completely imploded. They were turning on each other like starving wolves. There was no more golden child. There was no more scapegoat. There was only the harsh, devastating reality of their own greed and lies. I stood there for a moment, watching the chaos unfold. For the first time in 35 years, no one was looking at me. No one was blaming me. No one was demanding my money. They were entirely consumed by the destruction they had brought upon themselves. I calmly reached down and closed my leather briefcase. I snapped the golden latches shut. I did not say goodbye. I did not offer any words of comfort or anger. I simply turned around and walked out of the dining room, leaving them screaming and tearing each other apart in the ruins of their own making. I walked out the front door into the bright afternoon sun, got into my car, and drove back to the city, finally free of the heavy chains I had carried my entire life. I had walked out of my parents' house, leaving them to tear each other apart over the missing $400,000. I thought that would be the end of it. I assumed the sheer devastation of their financial ruin would force them into quiet humility. But I underestimated just how dangerous entitled people can be when their supply of money and attention is suddenly cut off. Rachel and Terrence were finally facing the reality of having to actually work for a living, and instead of taking responsibility, they decided to play dirty. It started 48 hours after the lawyer ran out of the dining room. I was sitting at my desk at Apex Holdings reviewing a new commercial lease agreement when my personal cell phone started buzzing incessantly. It was not my parents. It was my Aunt Carol, then my cousin David, then an old college roommate I had not spoken to in 3 years. The text messages were a barrage of absolute disgust. "How could you do that to your own sister? You are a monster, Lauren. I hope your money keeps you warm at night because you have no soul." I opened up my social media accounts, and the reason for the sudden outrage became immediately clear. Rachel had posted a 7-minute video on every single platform she had. She was sitting on a cheap, lumpy mattress in what looked like a budget motel room, deliberately framing the shot to make her situation look as desperate and impoverished as possible. She was wearing no makeup, her hair was messy, and she was crying hysterically, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest. In between dramatic, heavy sobs, Rachel spun a masterpiece of absolute fiction. She told her thousands of followers that her greedy millionaire sister had stolen the family cabin through a deceitful legal loophole while my father was confused. But she did not stop there. She looked directly into the camera, tears streaming down her face, and claimed that I had forced her and her husband out into a blinding blizzard with no coats and no warning, laughing while they shivered. Then came the ultimate weapon. She rested her hand gently on her stomach and tearfully announced that she was newly pregnant and that my cruelty had severely endangered the life of her unborn child. The video was going viral within our extended social circle and bleeding out into the public algorithm. Distant relatives, who had never bothered to call me on my birthday, were suddenly leaving vicious comments demanding I give the house back. My inbox was flooding with hate messages from strangers who had stumbled across the post calling for my job. Rachel was brilliantly painting me as a soulless corporate villain and herself as the innocent pregnant martyr. My assistant knocked tentatively on my glass office door, looking incredibly uncomfortable. She held up her tablet, showing me the paused video of my crying sister. "Lauren," she asked quietly, "is everything all right?" The receptionist just buzzed up and said people are starting to call the main corporate line asking for your termination. They are flooding our business review pages. I looked at the frozen frame of my sister's fake tears. A younger version of me would have panicked. I would have drafted a frantic apology or tried to explain my side of the story in the comments section, only to be shouted down by an angry internet mob that had already made up its mind. But the woman sitting behind that mahogany desk was entirely done playing defense. I smiled calmly at my assistant. "Everything is perfectly fine," I said. "Do not engage with any of the callers. Let them leave voicemails and flag the fake reviews for removal. We are not going to react." I knew I had the ultimate trump card sitting on the encrypted cloud servers of my Aspen home security system. But I did not release it right away. I wanted Rachel to feel completely confident. I wanted her to soak up the sympathy and double down on her lies, so that when the truth finally came out, the impact would be utterly devastating. But Terrence was not patient enough to let the internet do the work. He was completely broke, his crypto scam was exposed, and he thought the social media backlash gave him the leverage he needed to force a quick payday from me to save himself. He decided to take matters into his own hands and escalate the situation from digital harassment to a physical threat. 2 days after the video went live, I was in the middle of a high-stakes conference call with a major investor when the heavy double doors of my firm's reception area burst open. My office has glass walls, so I had a clear view of the lobby. Terrence marched right past the security desk, ignoring the receptionist who stood up and loudly demanded he sign in. He was wearing a wrinkled hoodie and looked completely unhinged, his eyes wild with desperate anger. He spotted me through the glass and marched straight toward my office. He shoved my assistant out of the way and threw my door open so hard the metal handle left a deep dent in the drywall. "Payday, Lauren!" he shouted, his voice echoing across the entire floor. Every employee in the open concept workspace stopped typing and turned to stare at the commotion. Terrence slammed his heavy hands flat on my desk, leaning aggressively over my dual monitors. "You are going to write me a check for $200,000 right now, or I am going to make sure that video reaches every single one of your top-tier clients. I will ruin your entire career. I will stand outside this building with a megaphone until your bosses fire you." I did not flinch. I did not mute my conference call. I simply reached under the lip of my desk and pressed the silent panic button wired directly to the commercial building's main security hub. "Terrence, you are trespassing on private corporate property," I said, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any fear. "You have exactly 10 seconds to turn around and walk out of this building before I have you physically removed." He laughed, a loud, ugly sound that reeked of pure desperation. "You think you can just snap your fingers and make me disappear? I am not leaving until I get my money. Your reputation is tanking, Lauren. Everyone knows what you did to your pregnant sister. You owe us this cash. You ruined my life." He reached aggressively across the desk and grabbed my laptop, trying to pull it toward him to intimidate me. That was his final, catastrophic mistake. Before he could even lift the machine off the docking station, the heavy footsteps of 3 building security guards pounded into my office. They were large men, ex-military, and they did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. One of them grabbed Terrence by the back of his hoodie, pulling him violently away from my desk. "Get your hands off me!" Terrence screamed, flailing his arms wildly and shoving the security guard backward into the glass wall. "I am family. I have a right to be here." The moment he made physical contact with the guard, the situation legally escalated from trespassing to assault. The 2 other guards immediately moved in, taking Terrence down to the carpeted floor. He thrashed and kicked, knocking over a heavy potted plant and screaming obscenities, but they quickly pinned his arms tightly behind his back and secured his wrists with heavy-duty zip ties. My coworkers watched in stunned silence as the arrogant man who had constantly demanded my obedience at the dinner table was now pressed face down into the commercial carpeting, whining that his shoulder hurt. The city police arrived less than 5 minutes later. They hauled him up, reading him his Miranda rights, and informed him he was being charged with criminal trespassing, corporate harassment, and assault. As the police officers marched him out of my office in handcuffs, Terrence looked back at me over his shoulder. His arrogant bravado was completely gone, replaced by genuine wide-eyed terror. He realized in that exact moment that he was not untouchable, and that his actions finally had real-world consequences. I calmly picked up my fallen laptop, wiped a smudge off the screen, and reconnected it to the dock. I apologized to the investor on the conference call for the brief interruption and finished the meeting as if nothing had happened. Once the call ended, I opened my web browser. Terrence had brought the fight directly to my doorstep, and Rachel had tried to ruin my name. It was time to end it. I logged into the security portal for the Aspen house and downloaded the high-definition footage from the back patio camera. It was time to show the internet exactly what kind of victim my sister really was. 2 days after the eviction in Aspen, I was back in my corporate office in Chicago. My phone had been blissfully quiet since I blocked their numbers. But my family was not going to let a multi-million-dollar property slip away without a fight. On Tuesday morning, the receptionist handed me a thick certified envelope. It was a formal legal summons demanding my immediate presence at my parents' primary suburban home for a mandatory settlement conference. The letterhead belonged to a man named Gary Reynolds, an attorney whose office address was listed above a strip mall dry cleaner. I did not panic. I simply went down to the legal archives on the 4th floor of my building, retrieved the original contracts, and placed them in my leather briefcase. Then I walked out to the parking garage and started the long drive out to the suburbs. The entire drive I thought about how predictable they were. They never took accountability. They always looked for a way to force someone else to clean up their mess, and they always used intimidation to get their way. When I pulled into the wide circular driveway of their massive colonial house, the reality of their situation was immediately apparent. Rachel and Terrence had parked their luxury SUV directly on the pristine front lawn, crushing my mother's prized rose bushes. The trunk was open, and several designer suitcases were piled carelessly on the grass. They had clearly moved in, and the stress of having a full house was already showing. I walked up the stone steps and rang the doorbell. My mother Susan opened the door. Her hair was unkempt, and she looked like she had not slept in days. She did not say hello. She did not ask how I was doing. She just glared at me with pure venom, crossed her arms, and pointed silently toward the formal dining room. I walked into the room and found the entire family sitting around the long mahogany table. The atmosphere in the room was thick with hostility. My father Richard sat at the head, looking exhausted but deeply defensive. Rachel was dabbing her perfectly dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the traumatized victim. Terence was standing behind her chair with his arms crossed over his chest, trying to look physically imposing. Next to my father sat Gary Reynolds. Gary was wearing a cheap, shiny gray suit that looked completely out of place in my parents' wealthy home. He had a manila folder spread open in front of him, and he was tapping his plastic pen against the wood with an arrogant smirk. "Have a seat, Lauren," the lawyer said, gesturing to the single, empty wooden chair at the opposite end of the table. "We have a lot to discuss, and frankly, it is in your best financial interest to cooperate with us today." I did not sit down. I placed my leather briefcase softly on the table and stood perfectly straight. "I am perfectly comfortable standing," I said. "You called this meeting, Gary. Go ahead and speak." Terence immediately broke away from Rachel's chair and took heavy, aggressive steps toward me. He stopped less than a foot away, towering over me, trying to use his sheer physical size to intimidate me into submission. He smelled like cheap cologne and stale coffee. "Do not come in here acting like you own the place," Terence growled, leaning down so his face was inches from mine. I could feel the heat of his anger radiating off him. "You are not at your fancy corporate office anymore, Lauren. You cannot just hide behind your security guards and your spreadsheets. You are going to sit down, shut your mouth, listen to what the man says, and fix the mess you made. You owe my wife an apology, and you owe me a massive check for the inconvenience." I did not step back. I did not flinch. I did not even look at Terence. I kept my eyes completely locked on the lawyer, waiting for him to make his move. I had spent years dealing with aggressive male executives who tried to bully me in boardrooms. Terence was nothing but an unemployed amateur throwing a temper tantrum. Rachel let out a loud, dramatic sob, dropping her head into her hands. "You almost killed us out there, Lauren," she cried, her voice cracking with fake emotion. "I am pregnant and you threw me out into a blizzard. We had to pack our things in trash bags. We are practically homeless because of your insane jealousy. You have to make this right." Gary cleared his throat and puffed out his chest, clearly trying to project legal authority. "Your family has retained my services to file a massive civil lawsuit against you and your company, Lauren." He began, his voice loud and theatrical. "You executed an illegal self-help eviction on a pregnant woman and elderly individuals in freezing conditions. You completely bypassed the county housing court. My clients are prepared to sue you for wrongful eviction, severe emotional distress, gross negligence, and property endangerment. We will drag you through the courts, we will contact your investors, and we will tie your company up in litigation for years until you are bankrupt. You will lose your job, you will lose your license, and you will lose everything you have worked for." My father leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "All you have to do, Lauren, is sign the Aspen property back over to me and pay Rachel a settlement for the emotional trauma you caused her," he said, his tone condescending, as if he was offering me a generous favor. "If you do that, we will drop the lawsuit and we will not report you to your corporate board." They really thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought a cheap strip mall attorney with a loud voice and a few legal buzzwords was going to scare an asset manager who dealt with multi-million-dollar hostile acquisitions on a weekly basis. Terence smirked down at me, clearly waiting for me to break down and apologize. I popped the golden latches on my briefcase. The sharp click echoed in the quiet room. I reached inside and pulled out a thick, heavy file folder bound with a black legal clip. I walked slowly around the table, ignoring Terence completely, and set the folder down directly in front of Gary. "I am not sure what law school you attended, Gary," I said, keeping my voice low and dangerously calm. But before you threaten a commercial real estate firm with a multi-million-dollar illegal eviction lawsuit, you should probably do the bare minimum and check the county deed registry. You are sitting at a table with people who have absolutely no legal rights to the property they are crying about. Gary frowned, looking down at the folder. He opened the cover slowly. That is a certified copy of a warranty deed in lieu of foreclosure, I explained, watching the arrogant color slowly drain from the lawyer's face. 3 months ago, my father defaulted on a $400,000 home equity line of credit. To save him from a bank foreclosure, my holding company purchased the debt and acquired the property free and clear. My father signed those documents in the presence of a corporate notary. He was not a homeowner. He was a temporary commercial tenant. And as you can see on page 12, that tenancy is instantly nullified if the tenant creates a severe liability hazard on the premises. I pointed at the document, tapping the exact paragraph with my index finger. Locking the legal property owner outside in 12-degree weather without winter clothing constitutes a severe liability hazard. The county sheriff reviewed these exact documents yesterday morning, which is why they executed the civil standby. There was no illegal eviction. Your clients were trespassing on corporate property. Gary was completely silent. His eyes darted frantically across the pages, reading the ironclad corporate legal jargon that he was entirely unqualified to fight. He flipped to the back page and saw my father's signature right next to the bright blue notary stamp. The evidence was irrefutable. Terrence slammed his hand on the table. "Do not listen to her, man," he shouted at the lawyer, his voice echoing in the dining room. "She is lying. She manipulated the paperwork. Sue her right now." Gary closed the folder. He did not say a word to my father. He did not look at Terrence. He just quickly shoved his plastic pen into his pocket, grabbed his cheap briefcase, and stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. "Where the hell are you going?" Terrence demanded, grabbing the lawyer's shoulder, his fingers digging into the cheap suit fabric. "Tell her she has to pay us. Do your job." "Move out of my way," Gary snapped, shoving Terrence's hand off his shoulder with surprising force. "I am not getting disbarred over this nonsense. You people completely lied to me about who owned the house. You told me she changed the locks on your primary residence. You never mentioned a commercial acquisition or a defaulted line of credit. I suggest you find another attorney, because I am officially withdrawing my representation effective immediately, and I will be sending you a bill for my time today." The lawyer practically jogged out of the dining room, desperate to escape the massive legal liability my family had just tried to drag him into. We heard the heavy front door open and slam shut a second later. The silence that followed was absolute and deafening. My mother slowly turned her head and looked at my father. The smug, confident expression she had worn just moments ago was entirely gone. Rachel stopped pretending to cry, her mouth hanging slightly open. Terrence stood frozen, his aggressive posture crumbling into sheer confusion. The cheap lawyer was supposed to be their silver bullet, and I had just disarmed him with a single piece of paper. The illusion of their control was breaking, but as I reached back into my briefcase, I knew they still had no idea just how deep the financial hole really was. The heavy mahogany front door clicked shut behind the lawyer, leaving a suffocating silence in the formal dining room. For a few long seconds, no one moved. The arrogant facade my family had meticulously maintained for 35 years was currently cracking right down the middle. My mother, Susan, was the first to break the silence. She slowly turned her head away from the empty doorway and looked at my father. The smug, confident expression she had worn just moments ago to intimidate me was entirely gone. Her face was pale and her hands were trembling as she gripped the edge of the dining table. "Richard," she whispered, her voice barely recognizable. "What did that lawyer just say? What default? What home equity line of credit? You told me the house was completely fine. You told me Lauren was just throwing a tantrum and trying to steal from us." My father was sweating profusely. He could not look my mother in the eye. He stared down at his empty hands, his chest heaving with panicked breaths. "Susan, please," he stammered, sounding like a terrified child rather than the commanding patriarch he always pretended to be. "It is complicated. The market took a severe downturn earlier this year, and I had to make some rapid financial adjustments. I was going to buy the Aspen house back from Lauren next year when the investments paid off. I swear I had a plan. Rachel stood up from her chair, her fake tears instantly vanishing. She looked back and forth between my parents, her bright blue eyes wide with genuine panic. "Wait a minute," she said, her voice rising in pitch. "Dad, did you lose the Aspen house? That was supposed to be my inheritance. You told Terrence and me that we were completely covered. What happened to your retirement accounts?" I stood at the end of the table, my hand resting on the smooth leather of my open briefcase. The family front had finally fractured, but it had not shattered yet. They still did not know the worst part. They still thought my father was just a victim of a bad stock market swing. They still believed in the illusion of his financial competence. It was time to completely destroy the lie. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out the second folder. This one was much thinner than the legal deeds. It contained only printed bank records and corporate audit summaries. I tossed it onto the center of the mahogany table where the bright white paper contrasted sharply against the dark wood. "He did not lose the money in the stock market, Mother," I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the rising panic in the room. "When my holding company acquired his debt, my compliance team requested a full financial audit of his accounts to understand how a $400,000 line of credit disappeared in less than 10 months. My father lunged forward out of his chair, scraping the wood loudly against the floor. "Lauren, stop," he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "Do not show them that, I am begging you." But Terrence was closer to the table. He snatched the folder up before my father could reach it and ripped the cover open. As his eyes scanned the highlighted bank transfer logs, his imposing physical presence seemed to shrink. The arrogant smirk he had worn all morning melted into an expression of sheer, absolute horror. He slowly backed away from the table, staring at the papers as if they were covered in poison. "Read the routing numbers," I instructed, pointing at the documents in Terrence's shaking hands. "Tell them where the money went." Terrence could not speak. His jaw opened and closed, but no sound came out. Since Terrence has suddenly lost his voice, I will explain it. I continued walking slowly around the table. My father did not make a bad trade on Wall Street. He wired $400,000 directly into a shell corporate account owned by an LLC registered in Terrence's name. My mother let out a blood-curdling shriek. She grabbed her hair, her eyes wide with shock. "Richard!" She screamed at my father, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me you did not give our entire life savings to this worthless man." My father collapsed back into his chair, burying his face in his hands and sobbing loudly. "Terrence told me it was a guaranteed crypto mining startup." My father cried, his voice muffled by his fingers. "He said it would triple our money in 6 months. He showed me charts. He showed me financial projections. I just wanted to secure the family legacy so Rachel and the baby would never have to worry." But the company vanished. The servers did not exist. The money is completely gone. The room erupted. Rachel turned slowly to look at her husband. The golden child, the woman who had spent her entire life expecting luxury and endless pampering, was suddenly staring at the man who had secretly bankrupted her family. "Terrence, you told me your crypto investments were tied up," Rachel whispered, her voice trembling with a rage I had never heard from her before. "You told me you were building an empire for our baby. You said we were going to buy a yacht next year." Terrence took a step back, holding his hands up defensively, dropping the bank statements all over the floor. "Baby, listen to me," he stammered, sweat pouring down his forehead. "The market crashed. It was not my fault. The exchange froze my assets. It was a temporary liquidity issue. I was going to make it all back before anyone found out." "You stole my parents' money!" Rachel screamed, lunging at him and hitting him in the chest with her fists. "You lost my inheritance. You told me we were rich. We are broke. We have nothing because of you." Terrence grabbed her wrists, trying to push her away, yelling that her father was the one stupid enough to sign the wire transfers without verifying the corporate structure. My mother was screaming at both of them, throwing a heavy crystal water glass across the room, where it shattered violently against the wall. She called Terrence a parasite and told him to get out of her house. Terrence yelled back that he was not going anywhere because he had squatters' rights. My father just sat there weeping into his hands, a broken, pathetic man who had sacrificed his entire family to protect his own fragile ego. The perfect toxic family dynamic had completely imploded. The carefully constructed hierarchy that placed Rachel and Terrence at the top and me at the absolute bottom had been incinerated by the truth. They were turning on each other like starving wolves locked in a cage. There was no more golden child. There was no more respected patriarch. There was only the harsh, devastating reality of their own greed, lies, and staggering incompetence. I stood by my briefcase for a moment, simply watching the chaos unfold. For the first time in 35 years, no one was looking at me. No one was blaming me for their unhappiness. No one was demanding my money to fix their mistakes. They were entirely consumed by the destruction they had brought upon themselves. I calmly reached down and closed my leather briefcase. I snapped the golden latches shut with a satisfying click that was completely drowned out by my mother screaming at my father about divorce lawyers. I did not say goodbye. I did not offer any words of comfort, and I certainly did not offer any financial assistance. They had dug this grave together, and now they were going to have to lie in it. I turned around and walked out of the dining room. I walked down the grand hallway past the expensive artwork my father could no longer afford, and stepped out the front door. The bright afternoon sun washed over me, warming my face as I walked down the stone steps. I got into my car, started the engine, and drove back toward the city. The heavy chains of obligation, guilt, and unrequited love that I had carried my entire life were finally gone. I was entirely, completely free. The drive back to the city was the most peaceful hour of my entire life. I turned off my phone, enjoying the absolute silence of my car. For the first few days after I walked out of that dining room, my life was incredibly quiet. I went to work, I closed commercial leases, and I slept soundly for the first time in years. I genuinely believed that hitting absolute rock bottom would force my family to finally reflect on their actions. I thought the shock of discovering Terrence had secretly squandered $400,000 of my parents' retirement funds would keep them entirely occupied. I assumed the sheer devastation of their financial ruin would force them into quiet humility. I was completely wrong. I underestimated just how dangerous entitled people can be when their endless supply of money and attention is suddenly cut off. Rachel and Terrence were finally facing the terrifying reality of having to actually work for a living. Without my father's credit cards to fund their luxury lifestyle, their entire world was collapsing. They had been living in a high-end luxury apartment downtown, and with Terrence's crypto scam exposed and my father broke, they were suddenly facing eviction from their own home. Desperation is a dangerous thing. When a parasite loses its host, it does not just die quietly. It thrashes. Since they could no longer manipulate my father for cash, they needed a new strategy. They decided to pivot to extortion through public shame. Exactly 72 hours after the disastrous family meeting, the digital bombs started dropping. It was a Thursday evening. I was sitting on my living room sofa overlooking the Chicago skyline, drinking a glass of red wine, when my phone screen lit up. Then it buzzed again, and again. The notifications began pouring in so fast, the phone vibrated right off the coffee table and onto the rug. It was not my parents. It was my Aunt Carol. Then my cousin David. Then an old college roommate I had not spoken to in 3 years. Then a neighbor from the town where I grew up. The text messages were a barrage of absolute disgust and vitriol. How could you do that to your own sister? You are a complete monster, Lauren. I hope your corporate money keeps you warm at night because you have absolutely no soul. My heart beat a little faster as I picked up the phone. I opened my social media accounts, and the reason for the sudden massive outrage became immediately clear. Rachel had posted a 7-minute video on every single platform she had. I clicked on the video. Rachel had staged it perfectly. She was sitting on a cheap, lumpy mattress in what looked like a dark basement or a budget motel room, deliberately framing the shot to make her situation look as desperate and impoverished as possible. She was wearing an oversized gray sweatshirt. She had scrubbed her face entirely free of makeup, and her blonde hair was unbrushed and messy. She was sobbing heavily, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest, breathing in ragged, dramatic gasps. In between her heavy sobs, Rachel spun a masterpiece of absolute fiction. She looked directly into the camera lens and told her thousands of followers that her greedy millionaire sister had stolen the family cabin. She claimed I used my corporate lawyers and confusing legal loopholes to trick my elderly father into signing over the deed while he was heavily medicated for stress. She painted me as a ruthless, bitter corporate executive who was insanely jealous of her happy marriage and wanted to destroy her life just for fun. But she did not stop there. She needed a hook that would make the internet completely turn on me. She looked down, tears streaming down her face, and dropped the ultimate lie. She claimed that I drove up to the Aspen cabin in the middle of a blinding blizzard, broke in, and changed the locks. She told the camera that I physically forced her and her husband out into the freezing snow without any winter coats, laughing at them while they shivered in the driveway. Then came the final, devastating blow. Rachel rested her trembling hand gently on her stomach. She tearfully announced to the world that she was newly pregnant. She sobbed that my unbelievable cruelty had severely endangered the life of her unborn baby, and that she was currently experiencing severe complications from the freezing cold. The video was a masterclass in emotional manipulation. She knew exactly how to play the algorithm, and she knew exactly how to manipulate the public. She used all the right buzzwords to trigger absolute outrage: corporate greed, elder abuse, pregnant victim, freezing cold, cruel sister. The fallout was immediate and vicious. The video was going incredibly viral within our extended social circle and bleeding rapidly out into the public feeds. Distant relatives who had never bothered to call me on my birthday were suddenly entirely invested in my destruction. Aunt Carol left a scathing voicemail screaming that I was a disgrace to the family name and that my grandparents would be ashamed of the monster I had become. Uncle Gary texted me saying I was dead to him. The digital mob was growing by the minute. My inbox was flooding with hate messages from complete strangers who had stumbled across the post calling for my immediate arrest. Even a few of my casual friends from the city sent me the link, asking if it was true, their tone clearly horrified by the allegations. The local community groups in my hometown started sharing the video. Then the attack shifted toward my professional life. People started finding my LinkedIn profile. They were tagging my company, Apex Holdings LLC, across all social media platforms, demanding that I be fired immediately for unethical business practices. They were leaving one-star reviews on our corporate pages, calling the firm a predatory entity that abuses pregnant women. Rachel and Terrence were trying to build an uncontrollable digital army to destroy my life. They were completely broke and terrified of having to get real jobs, so they were using the internet to hold my reputation hostage. They figured if the public backlash got severe enough, my corporate bosses would pressure me to settle the dispute quietly to protect the company image. They were banking on the fact that I would write them a massive check just to make the public relations nightmare go away. I sat alone on my sofa, watching the view count on Rachel's video climb from 10,000 to 20,000 to 50,000. The comment section was a sea of pure hatred, calling for my head, demanding I give the house back, and begging for a GoFundMe link to support the poor pregnant sister. A younger version of myself would have had a severe panic attack. I would have drafted a frantic emotional response trying to logically explain the home equity line of credit. I would have posted screenshots of the bank transfers trying to prove that Terrence was the one who actually stole the family money. But I had been in the corporate world long enough to know that you can never fight an emotional viral lie with a logical spreadsheet. The internet loves a victim, and Rachel was playing the role with Academy Award-winning perfection. Explaining myself would only make me look defensive. I did not comment on the video. I did not text my sister begging her to take it down. I did not block my distant relatives who were sending me hateful messages. I just set my phone down on the coffee table and finished my glass of wine. They wanted a public war. They wanted to drag our family secrets out into the open for everyone to see, to use public sympathy as a weapon against me. They felt entirely safe behind their screens, thinking there were no witnesses to what actually happened on that freezing patio in Aspen. They had absolutely no idea that I had the ultimate weapon safely stored on my secure cloud drive, just waiting for the perfect moment to be unleashed. I was going to let Rachel soak up all the sympathy and attention she could possibly gather because the higher she climbed, the harder the fall was going to be. As the police officers shoved Terrence into the back of their squad car outside my office building, I sat comfortably at my desk, staring at the downloaded security footage. He had actually thought he could storm into my corporate headquarters, bypass security, and demand a $200,000 ransom to save my reputation. Now he was on his way to a downtown holding cell facing charges for criminal trespassing and assaulting a security guard. He had handed me the absolute perfect opportunity to finish what they started. I did not feel an ounce of pity for him. I looked at my computer monitor. The high-definition video file from the Aspen patio camera was sitting right on my desktop. I opened Rachel's social media page. Her tearful victim video had surpassed 200,000 views. She had gained thousands of new followers who were fiercely defending her and leaving vicious comments about me. She was basking in the digital sympathy, completely unaware that her husband was currently being fingerprinted at the local precinct. I clicked the reply button directly beneath her pinned video. I uploaded the raw, unedited security footage. I did not write a long defensive paragraph trying to explain the financial nuances of the home equity line of credit. I did not try to justify my actions. I let the evidence speak entirely for itself. In the caption box, I simply typed one single sentence. Since we are sharing family memories, I thought your new followers might enjoy seeing how you treat your sister when the cameras are off. I hit send and leaned back in my leather chair. The security footage was absolutely damning. The infrared camera was state-of-the-art, capturing every detail in crystal-clear high definition. The video started with me stepping out onto the patio in my thin silk blouse. It clearly captured the heavy deadbolt aggressively clicking shut behind me. But the most devastating part was the timestamp, and the weather overlay automatically recorded by the smart home system. It prominently displayed the temperature in the bottom corner of the screen, 12 degrees Fahrenheit. The internet did not see a pregnant victim being thrown out into the cold. They saw exactly what happened. They saw Rachel standing inside the warm, luxurious cabin holding a massive glass of red wine. They saw her laughing hysterically, her head thrown back in pure amusement, while I banged desperately on the heavy glass door. They saw Terrence standing right beside her, holding his phone up to record my humiliation with a massive, arrogant smirk on his face. And right before the clip ended, the camera clearly captured Rachel looking directly at me, raising her free hand and giving me the middle finger through the frost-covered glass. For the first 5 minutes after I posted the reply, there was total digital silence. Then the notifications began to trickle in. Then they flooded. The algorithm caught the raw drama of the reply and pushed it to the absolute top of the comment section. The internet reaction was swifter and more vicious than anything I could have ever orchestrated myself. The exact same people who had been sending me death threats just an hour prior were suddenly experiencing the intense rage of realizing they had been completely manipulated. The tide turned with brutal efficiency. "Wait, is that her laughing while her sister freezes?" one user commented. "This girl literally lied about everything." Another comment quickly gained thousands of likes. "She is drinking a massive glass of wine in this video, but crying that she is pregnant in her post. What an absolute psychopath." Rachel's carefully constructed narrative completely imploded in real time. Her followers turned on her with the kind of ruthless velocity that only the internet can deliver. People started screen recording my security footage and reposting it, exposing her lies across multiple platforms. The local community groups that had shared her original video were now posting furious updates calling her a fraud and a scam artist. My distant relatives who had texted me calling me a monster were suddenly deleting their messages and sending pathetic apologies, claiming they always knew there were two sides to the story. I ignored every single one of them. I sat at my desk and watched the view count on my reply skyrocket. 10 minutes later, Rachel's original video suddenly vanished. She had panicked and deleted it. A few minutes after that, her entire social media profile disappeared. She had deactivated her accounts, completely terrified by the tidal wave of public backlash tearing her apart. She had tried to weaponize public shame against me, and it had blown up entirely in her face. While Rachel was having a digital meltdown, Terrence was discovering the harsh reality of the criminal justice system. I received a phone call from the county precinct informing me that Terrence was being held on a $10,000 bail for the assault on my security guard. Normally, my father would have rushed down to the station with his platinum credit card to bail his golden son-in-law out of trouble. But my father did not have a platinum card anymore. Terrence had secretly drained all their liquid assets to fund his non-existent crypto mining company. They were completely broke. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon, my personal cell phone rang. It was my mother, Susan. I stared at her name on the screen for a long moment before finally hitting accept. I wanted to hear the desperation in her voice. "Lauren." My mother gasped, her voice thick with panic and exhaustion. "Lauren, please, you have to answer me. What do you want, Mother?" I asked, keeping my tone perfectly flat and professional. "Terrence is in jail," she sobbed, the sound of chaos echoing in the background. "He used his phone call to call your father. He said he went to your office to talk to you and your security guards attacked him. They are demanding $10,000 for bail and we do not have it. The credit cards are declining. Rachel is in the bathroom screaming that her life is over because of some video you posted. You have to call the police and drop the charges. Please, Lauren, he is family. He is a criminal." I corrected her calmly. "He bypassed corporate security, trespassed in my office, threatened to extort me for $200,000, and then physically assaulted a guard. I am not dropping anything." My mother began to weep loudly into the receiver. "We have nothing, Lauren," she cried. "We have absolutely nothing left. Terrence lost all our money. The lawyer quit. The landlord for their apartment just served them a 3-day pay or quit notice. They are going to be living in our house permanently and your father cannot even afford the property taxes this month. Please, you have to help us." Then came the pivot. When my mother realized that demanding my compliance was no longer going to work, she immediately resorted to playing the victim and throwing her golden children under the bus. "I never even liked Terrence," my mother whispered, her tone shifting to a desperate conspiratorial whisper. "He is a terrible influence on Rachel. He is a parasite, Lauren. You were always right about him. You are my smart, independent daughter. You were always my favorite. I am so sorry for what happened at the cabin. It was all Terrence's idea. Please, you cannot let your own parents lose their home." The sheer absolute hypocrisy of her words was almost funny. 2 days ago, she was sitting at a mahogany dining table demanding I pay for her luxury roof and telling me I was a bitter spinster. Now she was trying to rewrite 35 years of emotional neglect because she needed my bank account. I did not give her the satisfaction of an emotional reaction. I did not yell at her for lying. I simply let her finish her pathetic speech. "My attorney will be contacting you on Monday morning," I said. "I am willing to offer you and Dad a financial exit strategy that will keep you out of total bankruptcy. But you will have to play entirely by my rules now. If you contact me directly before Monday, the offer is permanently rescinded." I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I blocked her number again. I packed up my briefcase, turned off the lights in my office, and walked out to the elevator. The war was officially over. I had systematically dismantled every single weapon they had ever used against me. They had no money, no public sympathy, and absolutely no leverage. All that was left was to drop the final ironclad legal trap that would ensure Rachel and Terrence never saw a single dime of my money for the rest of their miserable lives. The weekend passed in absolute silence. Monday morning arrived with the crisp, cold clarity of a Chicago winter. I walked into the high-end boardroom of my corporate attorney's office. The room was intimidating by design, featuring a massive slate table, black leather executive chairs, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the downtown skyline. I sat at the head of the table. Next to me was my lead counsel, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Patricia, who specialized in bulletproof corporate trusts. At exactly 9 o'clock, the double doors opened and the receptionist escorted my family into the room. They looked like casualties from a war they had started and spectacularly lost. My father, Richard, seemed to have aged a decade in a matter of days. His shoulders were slumped, his face was drawn, and he could not bring himself to make eye contact with me. My mother, Susan, clutched a cheap fabric handbag, her eyes darting nervously around the opulent room. Then came Rachel and Terrence. Terrence had managed to secure a bail bondsman over the weekend, but his brief stint in a county holding cell had completely shattered his arrogant bravado. He looked exhausted wearing the exact same wrinkled hoodie he had been arrested in. Rachel walked in right behind him, wearing an oversized coat and large dark sunglasses indoors. The internet backlash from my security footage had been so severe and so relentless that she was genuinely terrified of being recognized in public. Her digital victim narrative had been entirely incinerated, and now she had to face the real-world consequences. No one spoke as they awkwardly took their seats at the opposite end of the long table. They huddled together, looking incredibly small. I did not offer them coffee. I did not ask how they were doing. I simply opened my leather portfolio and looked directly at my father. On Friday afternoon, the Aspen property officially closed with a cash buyer. I announced, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet boardroom. The house is gone. The funds from the sale are currently sitting in a secure corporate escrow account. My father let out a slow, shaky breath, closing his eyes. Rachel sniffled, adjusting her sunglasses, but she did not dare say a word. I know that Terrence squandered your entire retirement savings. I continued, looking back and forth between my parents. I know that you are facing immediate bankruptcy, and I know that you cannot afford to pay the property taxes on your primary residence. My mother looked up at me, her eyes swimming with desperate tears. Lauren, please, she whispered, her voice cracking. We have absolutely nothing left. We are going to lose the house. I held up my hand, stopping her before she could launch into another pathetic guilt trip. I am not a monster, Mother, I said calmly. Despite everything you have done to me, I am not going to let you and Dad sleep on the streets. I am willing to offer you a financial lifeline. I have carved out a generous portion of the Aspen sale profits to fund a modest retirement for you both. It is enough to pay off your current mortgage, cover your property taxes, and provide a comfortable monthly stipend for your basic living expenses. The immediate shift in the room was palpable. My father let out a loud gasp of relief, burying his face in his hands. My mother started crying openly, thanking me profusely. But the most interesting reaction came from Rachel and Terrence. Terrence suddenly sat up straighter in his chair. The defeated slump vanished from his shoulders, and a familiar, greedy light returned to his eyes. He nudged Rachel under the table. Rachel actually smiled, a tiny, arrogant smirk, pulling her sunglasses down slightly. They thought they had just been saved. They thought my parents were about to receive a massive lump sum of cash, and they knew exactly how easily they could manipulate my father into paying off their debts and funding their lifestyle again. They thought the gravy train was back on the tracks, but I was not finished. However, I said, raising my voice just enough to cut through my mother's tearful gratitude. I am not handing you a check. The relief in the room instantly evaporated. Terrence froze. I gestured to my attorney. Patricia slid a thick, bound legal document across the smooth slate table, stopping it directly in front of my father. The funds are being placed into a strict, irrevocable trust, managed entirely by a third-party corporate fiduciary, I explained, watching the greedy hope die in Terrence's eyes. You will not have direct access to the principal balance. The trust will automatically pay your approved housing costs, your utility bills, and your medical insurance directly to the providers. You will receive a prepaid grocery card that reloads on the first of every month. My father stared at the document, looking confused, but entirely willing to accept any terms that kept him out of bankruptcy. But Terrence was doing the mental math, and he did not like the outcome. Wait a minute, Terrence interrupted, leaning heavily over the table, his voice rising in panic. What about cash transfers? What if they have a family emergency and need to pull equity out? Patricia, the attorney, answered him, her voice ice cold. There is no equity withdrawal available. The trust is completely locked. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the table, and locked eyes with Terrence. Let me be absolutely clear about the terms of this agreement, I said. The trust pays for the basic survival of Richard and Susan only. There is an ironclad poison pill clause baked into page 4. If my parents transfer a single dollar to you, if they buy you groceries, if they co-sign a lease for you, or if they allow you or Rachel to sleep under their roof for even one single night, the trust instantly dissolves. Rachel let out a sharp, terrified gasp, ripping her sunglasses off her face. If that clause is violated, I continued, my voice dropping to a hard, merciless whisper, every remaining cent in the account will be immediately liquidated and donated directly to a women's domestic violence shelter. You will all be permanently cut off, and I will never answer another phone call from any of you for the rest of my life. The boardroom erupted into absolute chaos. You cannot do this! Rachel screamed, standing up so fast her chair tipped backward and crashed onto the floor. I am your sister. I am having a baby. You are starving your own niece. You are a psychopath, Lauren. Terrence slammed his fist onto the slate table, his face turning a deep shade of purple. This is illegal, he roared, pointing a shaking finger at my attorney. You cannot dictate how they spend their own money. I will take this to a judge. I will have this entire contract thrown out. It is not their money, Patricia replied smoothly, not even blinking at his outburst. It is corporate profit being offered as a conditional gift. You have absolutely no legal standing to challenge it. Terrence turned his fury on my father. Do not sign that, Richard, he demanded, grabbing my father's shoulder. Do not let her control you like this. We are family. We stick together. Tell her to give you the cash or we walk away. For 35 years, my father had always chosen the path of least resistance. For 35 years, he had catered to Rachel's tantrums and funded Terrence's delusions because it was easier than setting a boundary. He looked at the screaming, arrogant man who had stolen $400,000 from his retirement. He looked at his golden daughter who was currently demanding that he sacrifice his last remaining lifeline just to subsidize her refusal to work. And then finally, something inside my father snapped. Get your hands off me! My father shouted, his voice booming with a raw, furious authority I had never heard from him before. He shoved Terrence backward so hard the younger man stumbled. You stole everything from me, my father screamed, his face red with years of repressed rage. You promised me an empire and you left me with nothing. You ruined my life, you ruined my legacy, and you expect me to become homeless just so you do not have to get a job. Shut your mouth, Terrence. Shut your mouth and figure out how to feed your own wife, because I am absolutely done paying for you. Rachel burst into hysterical tears, reaching out for her mother. Mom, please tell him, she sobbed. But my mother just looked away, crying silently and staring down at her hands. The enabling was officially over. The bank was closed. My father grabbed the silver pen resting on the table. His hand was shaking violently, but his jaw was set with absolute determination. He flipped to the back page of the trust agreement and signed his name in bold, desperate strokes. My mother immediately took the pen from him and signed her name right beneath his. It was done. The trap had sprung closed, and it was completely inescapable. Rachel fell to her knees on the boardroom floor, sobbing wildly, realizing that her entire life of luxury had just evaporated into thin air. Terrence stood frozen, breathing heavily, his eyes darting frantically around the room as the crushing reality of extreme poverty finally caught up to him. I stood up from my chair and buttoned my suit jacket. I did not smile. I did not gloat. True power does not require a performance. Patricia will provide you with your finalized copies and your prepaid cards on your way out, I said, my voice perfectly calm. I picked up my leather portfolio and walked toward the heavy double doors. I stepped past Terrence, who was staring blankly at the floor, and I stepped past Rachel, who was weeping into the expensive carpet she could no longer afford. I walked out of the boardroom, leaving them behind me forever. I walked into the elevator, pressed the button for the lobby, and watched the silver doors slide shut. The cold had not broken me, it had simply taught me how to freeze them out. The reality of absolute financial ruin does not usually hit all at once. It creeps in slowly through declined cards and past due notices. But for my parents, the realization came crashing down with the force of an avalanche. After Terrence was arrested at my corporate office, and Rachel's social media campaign spectacularly imploded, the final remaining illusions in my parents' suburban home were shattered. The golden children had failed, the cheap lawyer had run away. And now there was nothing left to distract my mother and father from the terrifying math sitting on the desk in front of them. My father Richard had spent the entire weekend locked in his home office, frantically logging into every banking portal and investment account he had. He was desperately searching for a hidden safety net, a forgotten mutual fund, or a stock dividend that could pull them out of the massive crater Terrence had blown into their finances. But every screen he pulled up displayed the same devastating reality. The balances were zero. The credit cards were completely maxed out. The $400,000 he had secretly wired to Terrence was entirely untraceable, swallowed up by a fraudulent crypto exchange that no longer existed. Worse yet, my father finally had to confess the full extent of his financial mismanagement to my mother. The home equity line of credit he had defaulted on was not just tied to the Aspen cabin. He had cross-collateralized the debt with their primary suburban residence. Without the cash flow from his drained retirement accounts, he had absolutely no way to pay the massive monthly mortgage on the 5-bedroom colonial house they were currently standing in. The property taxes were due in 2 weeks, and his checking account had less than $900 in it. They were not just broke. They were weeks away from total catastrophic foreclosure. My mother Susan experienced a complete psychological break. For 35 years, she had built her entire identity around being a wealthy, affluent matriarch. She had hosted extravagant charity dinners, bragged about her luxury vacations, and looked down on anyone who did not meet her high society standards. Now she was staring at the undeniable fact that she was about to be destitute. The panic turned her vicious. She stormed out of the home office and marched straight upstairs to the guest bedroom where Rachel and Terrence had dumped their designer luggage. Rachel was lying on the bed, staring blankly at the ceiling, completely catatonic after the internet had turned on her. Terrence had managed to scrape together enough money from a shady bail bondsman to get out of the county holding cell, but he was currently sitting in the corner of the room looking terrified and completely useless. My mother did not offer them comfort. She did not coddle her golden daughter. She stood in the doorway of the bedroom and unleashed decades of repressed resentment. She screamed at Terrence, calling him a worthless criminal who had destroyed her family. She told him he was a con artist and a parasite. When Rachel tried to defend her husband, crying that he made a mistake and that they needed a place to stay, my mother turned her rage entirely onto her favorite child. She looked at Rachel and told her she was a spoiled, ungrateful liability who had never worked a day in her life. My mother completely snapped, realizing that the daughter she had pampered and protected for 3 decades possessed absolutely zero skills to help them survive this crisis. Rachel could not write a check. Rachel could not get a corporate job. Rachel was nothing but an expensive anchor dragging them all straight to the bottom of the ocean. In her desperation, my mother realized there was only one person left in the world who had the power and the capital to save her. I was sitting in my downtown apartment watching the city lights flicker to life against the darkening sky. My apartment was quiet, warm, and perfectly organized. I poured myself a glass of Cabernet, the good stuff that Terrence had demanded at the dinner table, and took a slow sip. My phone buzzed on the kitchen island. I looked at the caller identification. It was my mother. I had blocked her number previously, but she was calling from my father's cell phone. I knew exactly why she was calling. I let it ring 3 times before I finally pressed accept and held the phone to my ear. I did not say hello, I just waited. "Lauren," my mother gasped the moment the line connected. Her voice was unrecognizable. The polished, arrogant tone she usually carried was entirely gone, replaced by raw, hysterical desperation. "Lauren, please do not hang up on me. You have to listen to me. I am begging you." "What do you want, Mother?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly flat and devoid of any emotional warmth. "We are losing the house," she sobbed, her breath catching in her throat. "Your father just showed me the accounts. Terrence took everything. He took absolutely everything we had. The credit cards are declining. The bank is sending notices. We do not have the money for the property taxes next week. We are going to be on the street, Lauren. We have nowhere to go." I took another sip of my wine, leaning against the marble countertop. "That sounds like a conversation you should be having with your financial advisor," I said calmly. "Or perhaps Terrence can mine some cryptocurrency to pay your mortgage." "Please do not do this." my mother cried, the sound of genuine terror echoing through the phone. I know you are angry. I know we made terrible mistakes, but you cannot let your own parents become homeless. Then came the pivot. It was the most fascinating and disgusting display of hypocrisy I had ever witnessed. When my mother realized that begging for pity was not going to break through my armor, she instantly shifted her strategy. She decided to completely betray her golden children in a desperate attempt to win my favor. I threw them out. My mother lied, her voice dropping to a frantic conspiratorial whisper. I told Rachel and Terrence they have to leave. I cannot stand the sight of him, Lauren. He is a criminal. He is a parasite. I never even liked him. I told your father years ago that Terrence was a bad influence on Rachel, but he would not listen to me. I raised an eyebrow, staring out the window. That was a bold lie, considering she had affectionately patted Terrence on the arm and defended his cruelty just a week ago at the dinner table. And Rachel, my mother continued, sobbing harder now. I am so disappointed in her. That horrible video she posted about you. I told her to take it down immediately. I told her she was lying and that you would never do something so cruel. You were always right about them, Lauren. You are my smart, independent, successful daughter. You have always been my favorite. You are the only one in this family who actually made something of yourself. The sheer absolute audacity of her words was almost breathtaking. For 35 years, she had treated me like an unwanted burden. She had allowed my sister to bully me. She had demanded I pay their bills, and she had smiled while they locked me outside in the freezing snow. Now, because she was backed into a financial corner, she was perfectly willing to throw her beloved golden child directly under the bus and pretend she had always championed my success. It was pathetic. It proved exactly what I had always suspected. Her love was entirely transactional, and right now, I was the only one holding the currency. I did not yell at her. I did not call her a liar. I did not waste my breath pointing out the decades of abuse I had suffered under her roof. Giving her an emotional reaction would only give her leverage. It would show her that she still had the power to hurt me. Instead, I gave her the one thing that terrifies manipulative people more than anything else: absolute cold indifference. I let her cry into the phone for another 30 seconds. I let the silence stretch out, forcing her to sit in the uncomfortable reality of her own groveling. Are you finished? I asked, my voice steady and professional. My mother stopped sobbing, letting out a confused, wet hiccup. Lauren, please, she whispered. I am not going to discuss the past with you, Mother, I said. I am not going to accept your fake apologies, and I am certainly not going to pretend that we suddenly have a loving relationship just because you have run out of money. You made your choices, and now you are facing the consequences. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, but I did not let her speak. However, I continued, my tone shifting into the exact same cadence I used when negotiating hostile corporate acquisitions. I am not going to let you and Dad sleep in a homeless shelter. That would be bad for my corporate image. My attorney will be contacting you on Monday morning. We have drafted a financial exit strategy that will keep you out of total bankruptcy and keep a roof over your head. Oh, thank God, my mother gasped, bursting into a fresh wave of relieved tears. Thank you, Lauren. Thank you so much. I promise we will pay you back. I promise things will be different. I cut her off immediately. Do not thank me yet. I warned, my voice dropping to a hard, merciless octave. This is not a loan. This is a highly restrictive corporate agreement. I am holding all the cards, and you are going to play exactly by my rules now. If you try to negotiate, if you try to loop a cheap lawyer into the conversation again, or if you contact me directly before Monday, the offer is permanently rescinded, and you can figure out how to survive on the streets. Do you understand me? Yes, my mother whispered, completely defeated. I understand. Good, I said. Wait for the call. I hung up the phone. I blocked my father's number, ensuring they had absolutely no way to reach me over the weekend. I set the phone down on the counter and picked up my glass of wine. I felt a deep, profound sense of peace wash over me. The begging, the crying, the sudden desperate affection, none of it meant anything to me anymore. They thought the worst part of their ordeal was losing the money. They had absolutely no idea that the contract my attorney was finalizing would lock them into a financial prison of their own making and ensure that Terrence and Rachel never saw a single dime of my wealth for the rest of their